Sure, he heard himself say, the word coming from that darker place. Why not? He approached the bed with mechanical movements, watching himself as if from outside his own body. An out-of-body experience where he was simultaneously actor and audience. His fingers traced paths along her skin that brought no joy, his body performing functions that his mind rejected even as it embraced the twisted justice of the moment. He was possessed by a cold, detached fury that transformed what should have been an intimate act into something more akin to punishment. Each thrust was fueled not by passion, but by betrayal. Each movement a statement. This is what you've reduced me to. This is what you've made me become. When she asked him to finish inside her, the ultimate claiming in this twisted game they were playing, he did so without hesitation or pleasure, a final act of defiance against a world that had once again proven itself cruel and uncaring. Afterward, he felt nothing but a hollow emptiness as he buttoned his jeans and walked away without a word, leaving Sue sprawled on the burgundy comforter like a sacrifice on an altar. The hallway seemed to stretch before him, elongating as he made his way back to the living room where the true betrayal waited. Ted and Mary sat on opposite sides of the room when he entered, silent and not meeting each other's eyes. Co-conspirators suddenly unsure of their script. The digital clock on the VCR read 12:22 a.m. The new year had begun without fanfare, bringing with it a new reality he wasn't sure he could face. Well, Ted said, standing awkwardly, his movements sluggish with either alcohol or post-coital languor. Zaph couldn't tell which and didn't want to know. I'm going to get to bed. You two can sleep in the front room. Sue already laid out bedsheets for you. No mention of what had transpired, no acknowledgement of boundaries crossed or trust violated. Just the banal logistics of sleeping arrangements, as if this had been nothing more than a normal dinner party that had run late. Mary avoided Zaph's gaze as she led him to the small guest room. Once the door closed behind them, isolating them in a bubble of artificial privacy, she turned to him with an expression that could only be described as ravenous. She climbed onto him without preamble, her movements urgent and demanding. Did you enjoy her? She whispered against his ear, her breath hot and wine-scented. The casual way she asked it, the complete lack of shame or remorse, shattered whatever restraint Zaph had been clinging to. The fracture in his mind widened, the darkness flowing through the breach like black water through a broken dam. Yeah, sure, he replied, voice flat and dangerous. And what about you? Did you enjoy him? She began to say yes, but the word was cut short by the crack of Zaph's palm against her cheek. The sound echoed in the small room like a gunshot. Did you enjoy deceiving me? He hissed, striking her again with a force that would have horrified his former self. And making plans to trick me into this situation? Fear flashed in Mary's eyes, genuine fear that broke through her alcohol-induced haze, but she didn't pull away. Some twisted part of her seemed to be enjoying his rage, feeding off it like a parasite. It disgusted him almost as much as his own actions disgusted him. He held her there, forcing the encounter to its conclusion, his fury eventually giving way to a bone-deep exhaustion that pulled him down into unconsciousness. His last thought before darkness claimed him was that nothing would ever be the same again. The fragile facade of their marriage, of his life, had been shattered beyond repair. And somewhere deep inside, a voice whispered that maybe, just maybe, he'd wanted it that way all along. The new year had arrived, but the devil had come with it, and Zaph was beginning to suspect that the devil wore his own face. Morning arrived like an unwelcome guest, barging in through blinds that did a poor job of blocking the winter sun. Zaph's head throbbed in time with his pulse, each beat a reminder of the previous night's excesses, both alcoholic and otherwise. Mary was gone from the bed beside him. The sheets on her side were cold, suggesting she'd been up for some time, or perhaps she'd never returned after he'd fallen into his troubled sleep. The thought should have bothered him more than it did. He sat up slowly, the room tilting alarmingly before stabilizing. Fragments of the previous night flashed through his mind like a slideshow of someone else's memories. Ted's conspiratorial whisper, Sue's calculating eyes, Mary's unrepentant question. Did you enjoy her? The rage that had consumed him last night had burned down to cold embers, leaving behind a clarity that was almost worse than the fury had been. He'd crossed a line, several lines, and there was no going back. The realization should have devastated him, but instead he felt oddly liberated, as if chains he hadn't known he was wearing had suddenly fallen away. Voices drifted through the thin walls of the guest room. Ted and Mary, their tones hushed but urgent. Something about work, about Ted giving her a ride. The domestic banality of it was almost comical after the events of the night before. Zaph pulled on his clothes from yesterday, grimacing at the stale smell of beer and sweat that clung to the fabric. By the time he emerged from the guest room, the front door was closing, Ted's car starting up in the driveway outside. The house felt different in the daylight, smaller somehow and much less magical. The Christmas tree lights were off, revealing ornaments that looked cheap and tacky without their illuminated disguise. Dirty glasses and plates were scattered across surfaces, giving the place the dejected air of abandoned festivities. Sue appeared in the kitchen doorway, wearing a robe similar to the one from last night, but pulled tightly around her body, defensive rather than inviting. Her children, 3 of them, Zaph now realized, though he didn't remember seeing them last night, were eating cereal at the kitchen table, spoons clinking against bowls in a rhythm that set his teeth on edge. "Coffee?" she offered, not quite meeting his eyes. "Thanks," he replied, following her into the kitchen and accepting a mug of something that smelled strong enough to strip paint. The kids, 2 boys and a girl, ranging from perhaps 5 to 10 years old, stared at him with undisguised curiosity. "Are you Daddy's new friend?" the youngest asked, milk dribbling down his chin. Something in the phrasing made Zaph's stomach turn. "I work with your dad," he said simply. Sue shooed the children out of the kitchen with forced cheerfulness, sending them to get dressed and brush their teeth. When they were gone, the silence between the adults grew thick and uncomfortable. "About last night," Sue began, her voice low and careful. "I'd rather not talk about it," Zaph cut her off. The last thing he wanted was a post-mortem of their encounter, an analysis of what had been real and what had been performance. Sue nodded, something like relief crossing her features. "Ted took Mary to work. He's giving her a ride to the department store. She starts today, apparently." This was news to Zaph, though he supposed it shouldn't have been. Mary had mentioned applying at a few places yesterday, but he hadn't realized she'd already been hired. One more small deception to add to the growing list. "They'll be back around 6, Sue continued, eyes fixed on her coffee. "Ted says you should take the day off. First day and all." A thin smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Perks of sleeping with the boss's wife, I guess." The crude reference to last night made something twist in Zaph's gut, but he kept his expression neutral. "I should head home, shower, change." "Or," Sue said, and there was a new note in her voice, something hungry and desperate that hadn't been there last night. "You could stay. The kids will be watching TV in the playroom for hours. We could—" "No," Zaph interrupted, more sharply than he'd intended. The thought of repeating last night's mistake in the cold light of day, with children just a room away, was repulsive. Whatever darkness had driven him last night had receded with the dawn, leaving only a hollow regret. Sue's face hardened, the mask of the friendly neighbor slipping to reveal something uglier beneath. "Fine. Your loss." She turned away, busying herself with rinsing out a cereal bowl with more force than necessary. "I'll tell Ted you weren't feeling well." Zaph left without another word, walking the 3 miles back to his own shabby rental in cold that bit through his inadequate jacket. The fresh air helped clear his head, but did nothing to answer the questions that circled like vultures. What exactly had he gotten himself into? What was this game that Ted and Sue were playing? And why had they chosen him and Mary as their new pieces? And most troubling of all, why had Mary gone along with it so readily? By the time he reached Elm Street, a plan was forming. Not fully formed, but taking shape like a sculpture emerging from clay. There were things he needed to know, truths to uncover. And once he had those truths, well, he'd always been good at fixing broken systems, at identifying faulty components and removing them. The house looked even more decrepit in the harsh winter daylight, but Zaph barely noticed as he let himself in. His mind was already moving ahead, mapping out possibilities and strategies. People, he was beginning to realize, weren't so different from computers after all. Find the weakness. Exploit the vulnerability. Watch the system crash. The devil was in the details, as they say, and Zaph was suddenly very interested in the details.